And we're going to go back and we're going to start with a writing from one of our ultimate founding fathers from Pennsylvania by the name of John Dickinson. And John Dickinson thought it was particularly important that he published 12 weekly letters that we now refer to as the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. And he did it anonymously. And this was back in 1767. So this is well before the Constitutional Convention, where we talked about the founding fathers getting together and talking about independence in 1776. This is almost a decade before. The colonies were being subjected to the Townshend Acts.
Yes.
Sorry. And in Great Britain, they were looking to push a number of different acts and legislation toward the colonies. Among them, a Revenue Act, a Commissioners of Customs Act to enforce collection of duties and taxes, an Indemnity Act to put taxes on tea, and the New York Restraining Act, because at that time the state of New York, or the colony of New York, was not paying the crown to quarter their soldiers in New York City homes.
Yeah.
There was also I believe a Vice Admiralty Court Act,
right,
which was going to skew the judicial system as it was then operating more towards the crown in certain disputes. And John Dickinson said to himself, this is unjust. It's not something that we should tolerate. And he published 12 different publications in the Pennsylvania Gazette, I think it was called.
Right.
And ultimately they gained traction not only in Pennsylvania, but throughout the colonies. And he really was at the forefront of basically saying, no, we shouldn't tolerate any sort of injustice against the colonies. We need to get in early and stamp it out.
Right. And I mean, and I think, before we get into that, it's one thing that it's important that we also stress how really back then there was a dearth of information on what was going on. That's not like we nowadays where, you get information overload. You turn on the TV, you turn on the radio, for those of us that still get the newspaper in actual print form, back then everything was in print, and it was just very localized. Everything was a very localized source of information. You dealt with the town that you were in. Maybe if you were in a larger city, you got some of that information, but very rarely did it go beyond that. And it was these writers, these people, these movements that brought news from all the colonies and pushed a movement forward towards independence. What Dickinson would be doing back then nowadays would be essentially the person's own like Reddit forum or like, a web page or something like that, a blog. But back then it was, these people were most of the time were using their own money to publish these newsletters just because they wanted to get the information out. And if you were lucky, you would have, some gracious benefactor that would actually pay to have this put out. But most of the time it wasn't that way. But now we have the writings themselves.